A Chinese name or a Hong Kong name, but thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here at HKSYU University, so I want to thank the organizers at the university, at the center, for inviting me to be here. This is my first time in Hong Kong, and I have to admit there were people, including my wife, who told me that I shouldn't come to Hong Kong, that it was too dangerous. And I said, when am I ever going to get a chance to go to Hong Kong again? So I have to take advantage of this opportunity, and so far it's been wonderful. It's an amazing city. I spent several hours walking around today and was very impressed with what I saw. So thank you all for coming this evening. I'm going to talk about some key questions and considerations related to improving teacher quality. And since this is a workshop, I'm going to ask all of you to participate as well. I'm going to ask you to do some small group discussions. I'm going to ask you to engage in some back and forth question and answer with me. And please feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions or want to raise any points related to what I'm saying. So let me talk about, this is what I'll talk about. I want to talk about I really want to emphasize 2 points because we're talking about evidence-based practice. And so the 2 points that I really want to emphasize are, when we're looking at policy and practice, we really need to identify underlying assumptions related to given that are at the basis of certain practices and policies. And we may not even recognize that those assumptions are there. But once we identify the assumptions, then we should look at the evidence base below those assumptions, because each type of assumption will lead to a different policy or to a different practice. And so the assumptions that I'm going to be talking about relate to teacher quality. And specifically, I'm going to really talk about 2 questions about teacher quality and assumptions underlying each of those questions. So the first question is, are great teachers born or made? In other words, is being a good teacher intrinsic? Is it something that we're born with? Is it inherent? Or is it something that we need to, that we can apply certain policies or practices to people to become great teachers? So do we just need to identify great teachers, or do we need to identify people who want to be teachers and turn them into great teachers? So in order to kind of flesh out this question, in a few minutes I'm going to ask all of you to talk in small groups about the best teacher you've ever had. So just think about it right now. Who is the best teacher you've ever had? It could be a preschool teacher, a kindergarten teacher, a 3rd grade teacher, a high school teacher, a university teacher. But think about it. Who's the best teacher you've ever had? And then be prepared to talk about that in a few minutes. Not yet, in a few minutes. The other question that I want to ask you about and that I want to examine is, what do teachers care about? And that's an important question, because if we want to recruit teachers, if we want to induce certain behaviors from teachers, if we want to encourage teachers to work harder or teach better, we have to understand what it is, what are the incentives that they're responding to, what do they care about. And some of the research related to teachers and teacher labor markets sort of poses this dichotomy of, do teachers care about salaries, do they care about earning money, or do they care about working conditions? In other words, is it more important to make them happy in a good environment, teaching environment and working environment, or is it better to just pay them a lot of money? And that question, both of those questions that I'm asking have underlying assumptions and evidence bases behind them. So those are the questions that I really want to talk about this evening. But first, I want to establish that this is an important topic to begin with. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about the importance of teachers and teacher quality. Why are teachers important? Why is having great teachers an important thing if you want to improve an education system or a school or a community? But then I want to talk a little bit about something I call the mystery of teacher quality. which demonstrates that it's not so easy, even if we know that teachers are important, it's not so easy to know what we should do to improve teacher quality. And then I'll explore these two questions: are great teachers born or made, and what do teachers care about? And then we'll spend a little time talking about how do we use those lessons of identifying underlying assumptions and looking to the evidence base to develop evidence-based strategies to improve teacher quality. So before I continue, are there any questions about what I'll be talking about? No? Okay, so have you all decided who your best teacher ever was? Okay, just wait a few minutes, I'm gonna get there. And I'll tell you about the best teacher I ever had. So first, let's start with the importance of teachers and teacher quality. I think we all kind of intrinsically believe that teachers are important and that it's really important to have great teachers. So let me ask a question. How many of you have been or are teachers? Great. At what levels are you have you been an elementary teacher, a secondary teacher, a university teacher? Does anyone want to tell me what their teaching experience has been about? Or at what level or what they've taught? University. Are all of you university teachers? It's secondary. Has anyone been yes, in the back?
Community college.
Community college. Has anyone been a primary level teacher teaching children?
Just part-time nature, not really full-time.
Part-time. Okay. At what age?
It's about 10 years old.
10. So in the United States, that would be about 5th grade. So let me tell you, I should tell you a little bit about my own background so you understand sort of my own experiences and potentially biases. Before I went to graduate school and got my PhD, I taught elementary school, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. And I taught high school, 9th, 10th, and 11th grades. And so related to these questions I'm asking about are great teachers born or made, when I started teaching, I was a terrible teacher. I feel horribly for the students who had me in their first class. I started teaching with no preparation at all, nothing. And this was at a time, this was in Los Angeles, this was at a time when there was a great shortage of teachers. And in particular, there was a great shortage of bilingual teachers. And I speak Spanish, so I was hired immediately. So I was working at a law firm. I was working as a paralegal in downtown Los Angeles. I interviewed for a job as a 6th grade teacher. The next week I was a 6th grade teacher. With no preparation, none. And like I said, I was terrible. I didn't know what I was doing. But over time I gained experience. I received training, and I became, I think, a pretty good teacher over time. So that relates to the first question, are great teachers born or made? I didn't feel like I was born as a great teacher. I needed some training. The other question about what do teachers care about, I never went into teaching, and I don't think most teachers go into teaching to make a lot of money, right? Maybe in Hong Kong it's different. In the United States, that's not a path to riches or fame to become a teacher. So I did, but over time I began to realize if I want to ever buy a house, have a family, I need to do something about this terrible salary that I'm earning as a teacher. So, this is all to say that, I'm asking these questions in a sort of a dichotomous way, but I think they're much more nuanced than that. But they do provide a good framework for us to try to understand assumptions and bring evidence to bear on those assumptions. So, all this to say that I think most of us, especially those of us who have been teachers, have believed that teachers are important, right? Without a great teachers, what's an education system? It's really nothing. It's like, without basketball players, What's a basketball league or a basketball team? Nothing, right? So, but because this conference is about evidence-based practice, let's look to the research base to understand the importance of teachers. So, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in 2005 released a report, a cross-national studies of teachers and professional careers of teachers, issues related to teacher quality and teacher labor markets, called Teachers Matter. And this was a big cross-national study where they sent teams to over, 30, 40 countries and reviewed evidence and published a report that found what they called 3 broad conclusions from the educational research. And the first one is, the largest source of variation in student learning is attributable to differences in what students bring to school, their abilities and attitudes, and family and community background. In other words, who your parents are, where you live, are the most important determinant of how well you will do academically in your career. Unfortunate, but true. In a lot of the research over 50 years bears this out. Your success in school is largely dependent on where you live and who your family is, unfortunately. But of those variables which are potentially open to policy influence, so it's hard for education policy to influence the first point about who your parents are and where you live. But what can education policy actually influence? So the things that education policy can influence, factors involving teachers and teaching are the most important influences on student learning. In other words, teachers are the most important school-related input in determining how well students do in school. But here's the problem. There's little consensus about the correlates of teacher quality. That is, it is not clear how to identify good teachers. We know that good teachers are important, but what about good teachers? What is it that makes teachers great? So that third point I call the mystery of teacher quality. We know that teachers are important, but we don't know what it is about teachers that is great. But let me go back to the first point about evidence of the importance of teacher quality. So there have been a lot of econometric studies and other types of studies. I was trained in economics of education, so I tend to know the economics literature more so than other bodies of literature. And economists really hold a lot of sway in the field of teacher quality, at least in the United States. So I'm just going to provide a few results from the evidence in the economics of education. So for example, children who move from an average teacher to a teacher at the 85th percentile of teacher quality can improve by more than 4 percentile rankings in a year, an equivalent effect of reducing class size by 10. So if you have an average teacher 1 year, and then you have a really great teacher the next, you can really jump in terms of how much you learn over the course of a year. Now, why are Rivkin and his colleagues comparing teacher quality improvements to class size? Economists love to compare things to class size reduction. Now think about it, why do economists care so much about alternatives to class size reduction, to reducing the number of students in a class? What is it about class size reduction that economists don't like? If you think about what economists care about.
Cost and benefit?
Yes, they care about costs and benefits and efficiency. And they want to identify educational interventions that cost less and have greater benefit. Class size reduction is very expensive because you have to. What do you have to do if you want to reduce class size? What do you have to purchase? More teachers, right? You have to pay for more teachers, and that's expensive. You have to pay for more classrooms. So economists are always trying to find alternatives to class size reduction. What if we try this instead of class size reduction? What if we try that? And so they're saying, well, it's more efficient to make sure teachers are great than it is to reduce class sizes. So the next piece of evidence, a disadvantaged student who has 5 successive teachers who are one standard deviation above the mean in teacher quality can nearly overcome the mean difference in achievement resulting from being from a disadvantaged population. So in other words, improving teacher quality can be a way to close achievement gaps. In the United States, we have a long history of achievement gaps between rich and poor, between different racial groups, and so we're always talking about how do we close these achievement gaps. Well, Hammond and Rivkin, both economists, are suggesting that if we ensure that disadvantaged children have consistent access to high-quality teachers, maybe that's a way to close achievement gaps. Now, here's the problem with that one, which I will talk more about in my talk on Friday. It's very unlikely that a disadvantaged student will have 5 successive teachers who are really great because of teacher sorting and inequitable teacher distribution. But let's put that aside for a minute and just focus on the fact that if we could make sure that disadvantaged children, economically disadvantaged children, have consistent access to high-quality teachers, maybe we can reduce socioeconomically based achievement gaps, right? So another really important reason we should care about teachers. Also, comparing teachers to other school-level factors, variations in teacher quality explain between 7.5% and 8.5% of total variation in student achievement, a far greater amount than any other school-level input. That doesn't sound like a lot. Oh, so these variations in teacher quality is only accounting for 7.5 to 8.5% of student achievement, compared to socioeconomic background of students, which maybe explains 60 to 70%. But that 7.5 to 8.5% is larger than any other school-level input. For example, school infrastructure, school materials like textbooks, school leaders, any other inputs, those are much smaller than the effect of teachers. Okay, so all this evidence about the importance of teachers makes us think, or makes me think, great, we found the solution to achievement gaps, we found the solution to improving educational quality. Let's invest in teachers. But next comes the question of, what about teachers do we invest in? Where can we go with this idea that we need to invest in teachers? And that brings us to what I call the mystery of teacher quality. It's not clear what we should invest in. And that's why it's important to examine assumptions and examine the evidence base. So let's examine this teacher quality paradox that I talked about a few slides ago. So we know that teachers are important, but we don't know what it is about them that it makes them so important. Is it their education? Is it their training and professional development? Is it their participation in workshops? Is it something about them intrinsically, personally? Is it something about their experience? What is it? It's not totally clear. Also known as the mystery of good teaching or the mystery of teacher quality. So, this may come as a surprise at a university, but in many econometric studies, across many studies, there's very little evidence that a teacher who has a master's degree makes someone a better teacher, all else equal. And I'll talk about that all else equal in a minute. But also, so in terms of what we think about in terms of measurable attributes of great teachers, we think about their experience and we think about their education. So we find that a master's degree doesn't seem to make much of a difference. What about experience? That must make a difference. More experienced teachers must be better teachers, right? But this effect of experience appears to level off over time. So over maybe 5 to 7 years, teachers improve with experience, but at some point that kind of levels off. And so there's not much evidence that, for example, a teacher with 20 years of experience is more effective than a teacher with 5 years of experience. Now, all else equal, this phrase in italics is really important because this is economists use a phrase, a Latin phrase, called ceteris paribus, holding all else equal. Basically, the idea is, imagine an experiment in which you took randomly assigned two groups of teachers, one to a master's degree program and the other a control group that didn't have the master's degree. Would the group with the master's degree become better teachers? Now, it's very hard to actually do that kind of experiment, right? Who would agree to be a part of a randomized experiment, right? In which you're getting forced to get a master's degree. But the idea is economists are trying to ensure these conditions through econometric statistical techniques. So they're saying if we control all these factors statistically, we don't see a difference between those with master's degrees and those without. So, because we have this mystery of teacher quality, it's not clear what it is about teachers that we need to invest in that's important. I think we should look to our own experiences. So, you may be thinking, wait, isn't this conference about evidence? Is my own experience some type of evidence? And in fact, I think your own experience is at least evidence of what has face validity in terms of what actually might resonate with practice. I think teachers, for example myself, I was a teacher for 9 years in public schools in Los Angeles. I came into a doctorate, PhD program in education, and I felt people were trying to beat the experience out of me. That's not important, that's anecdotal. Forget about that. Learn these econometric techniques, because that experience is not evidence. Well, actually, now that I've been around for a while, I think it is evidence. It is at least evidence to help me identify things that are really important from a practice, from a perspective of practice. So that's what I'm asking you to now. Here comes the audience participation. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. I think most of you know each other. Yes.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay, that's great. So I'm going to ask you to turn to one or two colleagues, introduce yourself, and discuss, maybe for about 5 to 10 minutes, who was the best teacher you ever had? And again, this can be from preschool all the way up to graduate level. What did the teacher do? How did the teacher treat you? And what made the teacher great? Yes?
May I have a question? So what is good teacher? How can we define or measure?
I think this is being recorded, so.
Okay, so I want to know what is a good teacher, or how can we realize that this teacher quality is higher than another? So the definition of quality, teacher quality, and all the measurement accordingly.
That is a great question. Thank you for asking the question. And this is something I meant to address a few slides ago. So when I'm citing all these econometric studies, here's what they define as teacher quality. A qualified or a good teacher is a teacher who can raise student achievement scores over the course of a year. While a student is in that teacher's course, in that teacher's class, that student learns more than the student would learn with a different teacher. That's the definition according to these econometricians. So that's why they can't identify what it is about teachers, because they're looking at the cumulative impact of the teacher on student achievement growth. But that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to look deep into your heart and your memory. Well, it's sort of equivalent in that I'm asking you to think about in what class or with what teacher do you feel like you learned the most in your educational history. Try to think about one teacher. You have another question? I should have let you keep the microphone.
Clarify, it's just like you said, you want us to discuss which teacher make us learn most.
Yes.
So this learning, to me, I think sometimes maybe not so academic domain. Maybe that is, I learned something, value related or some other skills or knowledge or understanding, rather than the classroom. So we should limit it to the classroom learning, or I'm not sure.
General question. Any learning.
Remembering one teacher that you like, it doesn't matter what he or she had done
Okay.
in class or whatever. We're not measuring achievement, I think it's subjective feeling. Is that what we're exposed as?
Most.
Yes, a great teacher. Whether that means great in terms of how much you learned, or great in terms of you grew as a person in that teacher's class, or you recognize things about yourself, or did we yes, yes. Think freely, yes. Okay, is this clear?
Yes.
Does anyone need help finding a partner or a colleague? So look around, if you see someone who doesn't have a partner or a colleague, we can take about 10 minutes. Make sure everyone has a chance to talk about their great teacher.
咪呢度我又唔想留咗後面。
Great. So, do you have great teachers you can remember?
My name is Bill, and actually I'm from Characters Institute of Higher Education in Germany. And I'm advised and I teach pharmaceuticals higher diploma.
Best of the best, not like the best teachers.
Many years ago.
I'm from South Korea and I'm a PhD student for 1 semester.
Why you come here?
What brings me here in this country? There are a lot of reasons. Hong Kong has some economies that I can't
So now you stay at HKSYU
Yeah.
as an exchange student.
Yeah.
You are welcome. Then I think
Really? So that teacher was
Oh, yeah,
And was the advice that teacher gave you, was it related to his understanding, he, right? It was his understanding of who you were as a person. So it wasn't that this is generic advice that I give to everyone. This is advice
perhaps I
specifically from you.
experience when they ask me questions, my money come out. That is my primary industry. At that time, I was a very bad student. I'm very lazy, don't like learning, don't want to go to school. Even though I know study is very important. And I remember at that time I also interested in I just studied. I put a lot of time studying Chinese philosophy. But that teacher is very passionate and have a strong patience to all the students. I remember that one day
Where was your MBA?
I took her international lesson is about listening. Okay. During the lesson, I can't understand. I can't follow the
Florida State.
exercise. The listening exercise.
Oh, Fort Hays.
I don't know why on that day
I taught at Florida State
locked the door
in Florida before I came.
asked her to let let me listen to that English business
Yes, right, exactly.
because I do really want to know.
Well, so it's interesting.
Hear what is talking about there.
Had
So,
experience at kind of university and postgraduate. But what about early, like in your
at
early
that time, they still need to use the old
a great teacher when you
call
were
it
in primary school?
the tape recorder, something like that. Cassette. No, cassette.
Yeah, it's difficult to
I
do.
remember she played one small time for me for what is talking about. And then he tried to
Oh,
sum
like, right? Interesting.
at the end, only one sentence. I still can't understand what is it. He repeated to do it again and again and again. She almost entertained me for 1 hour. And then at the moment, I can't have said sorry. I think I don't have such talent. Very good student. I cannot understand English. I give up. But she still encouraged me and say that. One more time. At the end,
So it doesn't have to be formal. Teacher, like a librarian.
but that moment to me is very touching she stimulated my interest in English, and then I turned myself from a lazy student to be a little what I feel sure is a great teacher that is to me because her patience and encouragement. Even I can't have to say I give up. She still support me and give me confidence. So I will say that to me is very clear. It is
You know, that actually reminds me, when I taught high school,
So for my,
I was also a baseball coach.
it's my high
So I had
school
some of my baseball players
taught me
were also my
chemistry.
students.
So
And I felt like as
she's
a
good
baseball
in the sense that
I
she's very
learned so much more
knowledgeable
about them
and
than I did as a teacher.
knowledgeable, but she can
Because I
present the abstract information and materials very
I
clearly.
saw them interact with
Very good preparation
And that's kind of an informal teacher role that I think is often
and in the lecture she also likes
librarians, other people
ask
who are
questions, particularly challenging questions to
teachers,
stimulate
formerly
our thought
teachers, having
and
to
to push us to study more.
Thank you.
So
All right, did everyone have a chance to talk about their great teachers? Do you need a few more minutes?
few more minutes.
A few more minutes. Okay.
yeah, so that's pretty much about it. And I can get good results with her help teaching.
People are talking about their experiences in school and their teachers and their best teacher, the best teacher that they ever had. So these are the questions that they're talking about. If you want to join
Just wrote him some email and he's willing to spend time to have some discussions. Secondary school, who was history teacher, and she was in that year maybe was the first time but actually for like that teacher he didn't come for she was saying so beautiful because it was her first time children but she was really so passionate organize at least 3 times a week, like this show this kind of pressure. And I could feel it, even though I can't take some quality of education, I could follow her passion and she is my role model. So I think
Is this microphone for the audience?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Teacher, what teacher has to have is to like children feel I would like to follow to be a role model.
You still need a few more minutes? You found it? So, would anyone like to volunteer to tell us about their best teacher? You can talk about who they were, what they did, why were how did they treat you? Why were they such a great teacher? Would anyone like to volunteer? There's a microphone back there. Yes? So while we're trying to find a volunteer, let me just tell you that one time that I do this activity in a class. I teach a graduate level class called Teacher Quality and Teacher Labor Markets. And this is the first activity I do in the class. I ask teachers to talk about the best teacher they ever had. And one time, a student said, I was his best teacher. And I said, well, you get an A. No, I'm just joking. So let me tell you about, I am going to ask you to volunteer to talk, but let me tell you about the best teacher I ever had. And this teacher's name was Mr. Eichler. He was my 6th grade teacher. So I was about 11 years old. He was the first male teacher I ever had. So I went through, preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, so on, female teachers. So it was new for me to have a male teacher. And maybe that had something to do with it, because maybe I was entering a phase of my life where I needed a positive male role model, maybe. But also Mr. Eichler had very high standards and expectations. And the thing that I really appreciated about him, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but in retrospect, I was used to getting A's and B's, doing well in school, but I didn't really care about school. I cared about baseball. And that was all I cared about. So the first semester in Mr. Eichler's class, I was doing the same level of effort. And I got my report card, and it was D's and C's and D's, so bad grades. And I said, hey, Mr. Eichler, what's going on with this report card? I've always gotten A's and B's. He says, yes, I know, but I know that you can do better. And so he challenged me, and he recognized that I was not doing the best work that I could. And so I did really apply myself, and by the end of the year, I was getting A's and B's. And that kind of put me on a different academic trajectory, where I really started working harder, caring more about school and less about baseball. I still care about baseball, by the way. And there was one more thing about Mr. Eichler, that he had a presence in the classroom. He really commanded your attention. And there was something that he always said whenever he was talking to the class. He said, class, I want your undivided attention. And this is the first time I'd heard this term, and I thought, undivided attention? What does that mean? And so, I don't know. So all of those factors combined made him probably the best teacher I ever had. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to share now? I told you my story. Would anyone like to tell us your story?
Maybe starting from the front row.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Oh, and please tell us your name, by the way, also, when you...
I think you know me, I'm Wendy, teaching law and business here. It's actually a discussion from our group that the best teacher may not probably be the one who is getting you the best grade. But for me, I'm very lucky to be coming from a very good school, so everyone gets pass grade anyway in Hong Kong. A's, all A's, and if you got a B, you'll be in trouble. But then the teacher is actually having a very close personal touch with us. So I remember not what I've learned from her as a teacher, who is teaching me in secondary school, Chinese literature. What I remember best about her was she actually would ring me up if I'm feeling not well, or carrying me personally about my own improvement, not as class, but my own improvement. And what I like sports, not baseball though, softball. So she cared about those instead of just my academic results. So that makes me that person really great for me. And at different stages in my study, I mean, I bump into very good teachers, and they're good in different aspects. So I cannot define who's best teacher because they're concerned about my own improvement in my own pace, and somehow Kelly said the right word to listen to what my needs are. So it's very tailor-made kind of personal improvement.
That's right. I heard a similar story here about teachers really taking a personal interest and recognizing the individual student. Who is that student in front of them, and what it's going to take for them to learn? Would someone else like to share about their great teacher?
You can share. Hello, good evening. My name is Stephen Tan. To answer all these 4 questions, it's quite tough actually. You know, luckily I've met quite a good number of good teachers in my past career. When I was in the MBA program, I remember one teacher who taught business policy. And I remember this teacher, Dr. Martin, I guess. I couldn't remember his first name. And Dr. Martin, you know, taught business policy at that time. And one unique teaching skills he had was giving a lot of examples. Now, by the way, I'm not from education. I'm from a business school. So maybe the teaching style a little bit different from those professors in the Department of Education. Okay, for that teacher, I remember he gave a lot of examples, and that is number 2 right there. He also tried to share a lot of real-life examples, okay, not necessarily to be examples that he created, okay, as some sort of components in his teaching. Okay. For number 3, Dr. Martin treated us very, very, you know, fairly, okay, at the same level. He didn't put himself, you know, up there, okay. He treated everybody in the classroom the same, okay. And I remember the classroom, it was just like a family, okay, which is very nice. And he tried to open up, you know, the space for us as students, you know, to share experience, to share opinions. There was always no right or wrong answers, you know, at that time, you know. Because of that, I, as a student at that time, you know, was blessed, you know, with a lot of opportunities, you know, to share opinions. And while sharing opinions, I learned a lot, you know, unconsciously, actually. And for question number 4, I believe after so many years in education, I personally a teacher at a university setting right now in the United States. I observe a lot of good teachers, you know, on campus. I think one thing that I would like to highlight, you know, being a good teacher would be someone with human touch, you know, and those teachers, you know, would always try to, you know, close the gap between himself or herself and the students. So that's what I remember, you know, until now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's... Please. Because your teacher wasn't actually a teacher, right?
Yeah. So, hello everyone, my name is Louis, and I actually remember one of my best teachers is the tutor during my undergraduate study. So it's my first year of undergraduate study at that time, and during the time all of my classmates actually quite struggling in if we need to apply for another university or because I was actually not in a quite famous university. So most of my classmates thinking about transfer or taking again for the public examinations. So at that time I also be influenced by them, and I was quite confusing or quite struggling what my path is trying to be. And during the time, one of my tutors knows about my struggles, so he spent a lot of time to discuss with me about my pathway, about my personality, about how what kind of pathway maybe is possible for myself to choose. So I remember quite clearly about what he told me about one thing is maybe it's quite a better way for me to focus all my strength, all my effort on my 3 years of undergraduate study, rather than spend all of my effort and time to explore or searching but have no clear outcomes. So after that, I have tried all my best to focus on my study, and I finally get the first as my whole subject, whole discipline, and get a good result to get to master degree in counseling psychology. So I get a master counseling psychology master, and I become a counseling psychologist. But from time to time of my practice, I have explored, have engaged different education setting, from kindergartens to community college. I have actually explored different class students. And from time to time, I think about besides of counseling, because counseling can actually engage one student at a time. But if in education, I can influence different people, many people at a time, and I hopefully that can train the trainer and influence more people. So this makes me finally come back into a university as a lecturer to hopefully that I can use education to influence more people.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. So unless someone else would like to share, what I'd like to point out is that the three of you who shared, I don't think you told us about how many years of experience your teacher had, what education they had. Did they have a bachelor's degree? Did they have a master's degree? Did they have a PhD? You really talked about kind of the personal connections that they made with you, and similarly with my experience, and the concern that they showed for you as an individual, as a student and as a person. So, what do we take from that? Actually, first, let me encourage you, if you've never, how many of you have ever told this teacher what an impact he or she had on you? Well, I encourage you to do so. If your teacher, if you know how to contact your teacher, or your teacher is still living, contact them. Because my 6th grade teacher, that was a long time ago. Contact them, tell them, I was in this workshop and they asked us to talk about our best teacher, and you were the best teacher. I think that would really make their day. Maybe it will make their year. So this discussion leads us to, now imagine the policymaker or the school principal or the university president or provost who's trying to improve educational quality, is trying to design a system to create or identify, recruit, train more teachers like the teacher you identified. In that system, what would you look for? Would you look for a certain type of education? Would you look for some kind of training that they received? Would you look for a teacher with a lot of experience? Would you look for some type of demographic profile? For example, I talked about how my teacher, Ms. Dreikler, was a male teacher, and that had an influence on me as a male student at the time. And by the way, there's also evidence that, there is evidence from the research that In some cases, female teachers are better with female students, are more effective. Male teachers are more effective with male students. And same race teachers are more effective with the race of their student. Now, that may have to do with the level of expectations that they bring, or it may have to do with having a kinship with the student. But anyway, that's something to consider. Or is it their personality? Is it the personality of that teacher? Or is it something else? What do y'all think? If you were trying to design a system, whether it's a school, a university, an entire national education system, what would you look for to improve teacher quality? Based on your conversations that you had.
I would look for 1, 2, 3, and 5, except 4.
1, 2, education, training, experience, and personality.
That's right. Yeah.
And you wouldn't worry about the demographic profile.
That is the least important.
Yes. All right. Anyone else? No? Okay, well, let's take a look at, again, based on, since this is a conference about evidence-based practice, let's take a look at some evidence. And so I'm going to just summarize some findings from a study, a book actually by someone named Michael Strong. And the title of this book is The Highly Qualified Teacher, What is Teacher Quality and How Do We Measure It? And this was published by Teachers College Press at Columbia University in 2011. So what Michael Strong does, he does a big review of literature related to teacher quality and identifying qualified teachers. And this is what he finds. Teachers with a math degree or license appear to produce higher achieving students, but this does not hold for reading or language arts. So maybe having a degree, an advanced degree in math, or certificate in math, maybe that has some kind of positive effect on student learning. As I mentioned earlier, a master's or advanced degree does not seem to raise student achievement. In other words, teachers with master's degrees don't necessarily have better results with their students than teachers without master's degrees. Now in the United States, this is kind of not really surprising because most teachers do have master's degrees. And there's not that much difference between a master's degree, maybe you do 1 extra year versus not. But again, most teachers have a master's degree or they have a bachelor's degree. So there's not that much variability in education levels. Now if you were to go to an education system where there was a great deal of variability, like there were some teachers with primary school education, secondary, university, postgraduate, you might find a difference. But in the this research is mostly based in the United States. Doesn't seem to be much difference. Studies seem to indicate that teachers' effectiveness grows in the first 7 years of teaching, then levels out. In other words, teachers become more effective with time, with experience, until about maybe 5 to 7 years, and then that effect levels out. So like I said earlier, there's not much difference between a teacher with 20 years of experience versus, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 years of experience. So this is what Strong concludes. We must conclude from the research that we do not know with any degree of certainty which of the variables that have been postulated as representing teacher quality are the most important for student learning. Again, the mystery of teacher quality. And you all kind of described it right now when you were talking about your great teachers. There was something that maybe you could never have measured. Like if you were out there trying to find great teachers, maybe you would never have identified that teacher that you described because there's somewhat of a mystery. And this leads us to the question of, are great teachers born or made? Is it something intrinsic about those teachers that no amount of preparation, training could instill in them? Or is there a possibility that we can turn regular people into these great teachers that you've all described? Now, in order to explore this question a little bit more, I want to talk to you about two programs, two teacher improvement programs in the United States. And underlying each is an assumption about whether great teachers are born or made. Now, the designers of these programs may never acknowledge that there's an assumption underneath the program, but I think it's pretty clear that there is. So I'm going to describe the two programs to you, and then you tell me which program assumes that great teachers are born, and which programs assume that great teachers are made. So here are the two programs. Has anyone heard of Teach for America? No? So this is a program that started in the United States in the early 1990s and has now spread across the world. There are related programs that were inspired by Teach for America in over 30 countries, including I think there's a Teach for China program, and there's a program in Indonesia that's similar, but actually is not a Teach for America. It's not a, so the international program is called Teach for All. There's a Teach for All in India. There was one in Brazil that ended. There's one in Colombia. They're all over Latin America. There's some in Africa. So anyway, let me describe the program Teach for America. The idea of Teach for America is that you recruit outstanding and diverse leaders from leading universities to teach in low-income communities. So you go to the best universities in the country, in the United States. You go to places like Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Berkeley, top universities. You recruit young people to become teachers, right? And not just become teachers working in low-income communities, working with disadvantaged student populations. So that they might be urban central cities, they might be really poor rural areas, but those teachers commit to teaching in these low-income communities. Then teachers receive a short training, maybe 6 weeks, something like that, prior to entering the classroom. And then they earn their teaching certificates or their teaching credentials after or while they're working in the classroom. So they're working as teachers and they're going to school earning their teaching credentials. This, by the way, is the way I was trained. My training was very similar to Teach for America. I started with no experience. I did a short training, 6 weeks, and then I was a teacher. But as I was a teacher, I was taking classes to earn my teaching credential. Teachers make a commitment to teach for at least 2 years, and after that 2-year commitment, many teachers leave either to different positions in education or they just leave teaching altogether. But many Teach for America graduates are actually working in education in other capacities. So for example, they might be school principals, they might be school board members, they might be policy makers. So that's the idea of Teach for America. Recruit outstanding people, give them a short training, have them commit to at least 2 years. That's the first. The second is called the National Board Certification, and that started actually around the same time as Teach for America, but it's a very different design. So it's a voluntary system, and you may know about the United States. The United States is a federal system. It's pretty decentralized. So there are 50 states, and that means there are 50 different systems for preparing teachers, so 50 different sets of requirements. So one of the ideas of National Board Certification is, let's come up with a set of standards that any teacher in the United States can meet, and then that teacher could be considered, could be a teacher in any state. Rather than having to go through a different certification in a different state, this teacher who gets this certification could teach anywhere in the United States. So it's voluntary, it's for practicing teachers who meet rigorous standards. You have to be a teacher for at least 3 years before participating in this program. You go through a rigorous process of self-reflection and external evaluation. You do portfolios, you videotape yourself in the classroom, you take written tests, and then all of this is evaluated by the national board to see if you get that national board certification. Once you do get that certification, that lasts 10 years, after which you have to renew it. So you have to keep renewing every 10 years. If you get national board certification, in many systems, in many school districts or states, you get a salary bonus. It used to be the case in Los Angeles, you would get something like $10,000 a year, but then they hit budget crisis and that went away. But anyway, the idea is now you're an accomplished teacher. You've demonstrated to your colleagues and to the country, really, to the profession, that you meet this high standard. All right, so Teach for America, National Board Certification. Which one of these do you think assumes that great teachers are born?
Teach for America.
Yes. Why do you say Teach for America?
Do not rely on a system of training. They rely on the personality, the background of those teachers.
Yes, exactly. They're not worried about how much training these teachers are going to have and what are we going to do to make these teachers great. They're worried about identifying the great people who are going to be great teachers. And there's really not much emphasis on the teacher preparation. 6 weeks. Does anyone know Linda Darling Hammond? She's a very famous educational researcher in the United States who has written a lot about Teach for America, about, now, of course, there are people on the other side of the debate, but Linda Darling Hammond has argued this is really kind of devaluing the teaching profession by communicating the message that you only need 6 weeks in the classroom, and particularly to work with low-income students. Because oftentimes those communities and those schools are present the most difficult teaching environments, right? So the idea of Teach for America is we just need to find the right people and they're going to be great. And they're going to teach for 2 years and then they're going to make these great contributions beyond teaching. How about National Board Certification? What does National Board Certification assume?
So accrediting a teacher will, ensure high quality standards.
Yes. And you can't even do this unless you've taught for 3 years and you have your teaching credential. So this process is going to make you great, but it's also going to provide another level, as you say, of certification or qualification. So, like I said, the designers of these two programs maybe never acknowledged their assumptions, but really I think we can safely deduce that Teach for America assumes that great teachers are born, National Board assumes that great teachers are made. So let's look at some of the research evidence. Again, let's apply the research, what we know from the research base to each of these programs. So what do we know about Teach for America? In general, this is a study by Linda Darling Hammond, who I just mentioned, and her colleagues. In general, the students of certified teachers outperform the students of uncertified TFA teachers. So if you take a group of teachers who have earned their certification, their students do better than teachers in TFA, Teach for America, who are not certified. But if we compare likes to likes, and this is actually an experiment, a randomized experiment where they randomly assign some students to TFA teachers and some teachers to non-TFA teachers. They found that relative to a control group, a group that did not have a TFA teachers, TFA teachers have a positive impact on math achievement, but no impact on reading achievement. So TFA teachers, a little bit better in math, no difference in reading in terms of how well their students do. So, at the high school level, this study examined high school TFA teachers. They found that they're more effective than teachers who would otherwise be teaching in their classrooms. So they're actually comparing TFA teachers to what's known as the counterfactual. Who would be the teacher in that classroom if the TFA teacher were not there? So that's really trying to compare likes with likes. Not comparing TFA teachers to some other teacher out there somewhere else, but who would be in that classroom if the TFA teachers were not there? So they actually found somewhat more effectiveness, TFA teachers are somewhat more effective, but this effect of TFA is actually reduced after you statistically control for teacher test scores. So this suggests that TFA teachers have higher test scores, maybe because they've been recruited from these high quality top universities, and it's that higher test score, that greater knowledge of TFA teachers, maybe that's having that that influence. In other words, it's not necessarily the effect of TFA, it's the effect of what the teachers bring into TFA in terms of their knowledge. Now, in terms of the issue of teacher attrition in TFA, nearly 2/3 of TFA teachers, this is based on a national survey, remain in teaching beyond 2 years. So 2/3, that's pretty good. But less than 1/4 of TFA teachers stay in their initial low-income school for more than 3 years. So they initially committed to going to this low-income school, but most of them leave and maybe go into a school with greater resources, a school in a different community after 3 years. Okay, so some positive evidence about TFA, but not necessarily really compelling evidence that would tell us, okay, we need to invest widely in the TFA program, but some positive evidence. How about national board certification? So, national board certified teachers do appear to be more effective than non-national board certified teachers in raising student test scores. So it appears that, yes, they're better teachers, on average, in terms of their impact on student achievement growth. They also appear to be more effective in teaching disadvantaged students, which is really important when we think about achievement gaps. Also, in many school districts and states, when teachers receive national board certification, they actually get a salary increase, but that comes with some conditions. And one of the conditions in many cases is that they have to mentor other teachers. So they do help, there is evidence that they do help to make other teachers more effective when they mentor them. So that's an important kind of secondary effect of national board certification. But this is a question similar to the one we asked about Teach for America. It's not clear that the process actually makes teachers more effective. It may act as a signal of teacher quality. In other words, national board certification may be able to recognize those more effective teachers by having them self-select. They're selecting themselves into this program, they're going through this rigorous process, and by doing that, they're identifying themselves as effective teachers. But both of these programs, it appears that a lot of the positive effect comes from what's known as selection bias. In other words, these teachers, whether they're TFA teachers or nationally board certified teachers, are selecting themselves into these programs, and it's that self-selection that may be driving their greater effectiveness rather than the programs themselves. And this issue of selection bias, it's not unique to these programs. This process of selection bias is kind of the greatest challenge that there is in educational research. Whether you're talking about students, teachers, or some educational program. For example, comparing private schools to public schools. There's a huge literature on this. But the problem is, private school students look different in fundamental ways from public school students because of self-selection. Because their parents or they themselves have selected into private schools. And that's important to recognize when you're trying to compare which one's more effective. Well, you have to account for that selection bias in any educational program. So important for anyone who wants to do educational research, always think in the back of your mind, what about selection bias? All right, so now maybe this discussion has helped you to identify whether great teachers, or how to identify great teachers. Maybe not, maybe you have more questions than answers. But the next question we need to ask about teachers when we're trying to identify them or induce them to teach better or to work harder is, what do they care about? What do teachers care about? Do they care about salaries? Or do they care about working conditions? Or do they care about something else? This is an important question because just knowing what kind of teachers to recruit doesn't tell us how to recruit them or how to train them. We need to know what they care about. What kinds of incentives will actually induce them to do the kinds of teaching or to enter teaching in the first place. So economists use a tool called Compensating Differentials. This is an idea from microeconomics that dates all the way back to Adam Smith Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, he wrote about compensating differentials. And here's the idea of compensating differentials. It's a wage difference that compensates for the relative advantage or disadvantage of a job or location in the eyes of the worker. So if I'm considering whether I want to take a job or not, I think about this compensating, I think about the conditions of this job, and if it's a difficult job or a dangerous job or an unpleasant job, I'm going to ask for more salary to compensate me for that danger or that unpleasant working condition. In jobs with undesirable working conditions or locations, it's the additional salary an employee will demand to work in a given job. I'm going to work in this difficult job, you need to pay me more. That's the compensating differential. In contrast, if it's a great job with really pleasant working conditions, maybe you'll actually give up salary. Okay, I know you're not paying me a lot, but I love this job, and I want to do this job for the rest of my life, so I'm going to give up some salary to do it. Or maybe I'm working in a really pleasant location, so I'll give up some salary. There are two ways to calculate these compensating differentials. So economists use something called hedonic wage models, which is basically multiple regression in which they're taking a teacher salary and regressing it, relating it statistically to job attributes. And they're trying to find out, okay, do people with these job attributes make more than other people with different job attributes? And they're inferring, okay, if they're making more, that means they have a higher compensating differential. Or you could just ask teachers, right? Would you rather have this much money, or would you rather have this working condition? Now there are challenges to both approaches, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But first of all, let's think of some examples of these jobs. Do you think that each of these jobs would have a positive compensating differential or a negative compensating differential? Remember, a positive one is you demand more salary, additional salary to take that job because it's unpleasant or difficult or dangerous. A negative compensating differential means you give up some salary because it's a great job or it's fun or it's in a nice location. The answers here in Hong Kong might be different from the answers someone might reply to someone's answers in the United States. I don't know. I don't know what the job market looks like here. So let's start with architect. What do you think? Is it do people demand more salary, or do they give up some salary to be an architect? What's that?
Maybe negative.
Negative? Why negative?
Because people may like that kind of design and they like the job, so and keep their professional status, and it is part of their self-identity, so they can take the job maybe at less, have some less compensation for that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the same in the United States, actually. Architects, it's considered a really cool job. Hey, I'm an architect. You know, people are like, wow, you're an architect, you design buildings, that's really great. You know, it's a high prestige, and it's probably an interesting and fun job. I don't know. You know, I know a couple of architects, they seem pretty happy with their jobs. My son wants to be an architect. He's 9 years old. I tell him, that's great. That's great. Just don't expect to get wealthy being an architect unless you're one of those really famous architects who design great museums. So I agree, that's probably a negative compensating differential. Yes?
But I would take from a different perspective. Architect could be someone like a doctor, medical doctor. He or she pursue, you know, being an architect.
That's right.
Because of the money, because of the income. You know, architect, you know, would make more money, you know, in his or her career. So it seems to me that it is possibly positive. CDs.
Yes. It could be. It could be. If we examine, it could be quite different here too, but if we examine, empirically, if we examine, you know, salaries of different occupations with similar levels of education, in the United States anyway, architects earn lower salaries than you would expect given their level of training and education, and that could be because they're giving up some salary to do this really cool job. No, I'm not sure. That's as economists say, it's an empirical question. We can examine it empirically. But let's go to the next job. Deep sea oil platform worker. These are the people who are working out in the middle of the ocean on these oil platforms, and they're out there for months at a time. They don't see anyone else. They have a dangerous job. Positive or negative? Positive, probably, right? It's a dangerous job. You're isolated. It's probably not that fun. But they do make a lot of money, those people who are out there. College professor. This one's obvious, right?
Now maybe positive.
Positive?
Now, in Hong Kong, the
Really?
recent situation is positive. Because many angry students will be employed.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I didn't think about that. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll talk to the authorities. In my case, or in the United States I should say, it's very, very negative. I mean, if you look at earnings and education level, it goes up with bachelor's degree, master's degree, you know, maybe a professional degree, PhD, you know, because, you know, it's really a great job in many respects. You quote unquote have 3 months of it, you have summer vacation, which really isn't a vacation, but, you know, you earn, no, right? I've never had a summer vacation, even though theoretically I do have a summer vacation. But, you know, it's a nice job. It's fairly well regarded in society, and so we give a fair degree of fair amount of salary, I think, to have this job.
Can the answer to begin with negative but end up as positive?
Yeah, possibly, maybe. Okay, so I'm in a very nice hotel on the 12th floor. I look out the window. You know, I used to work in the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles, and every once in a while I would see these guys cleaning the windows outside. So imagine that job. You take one bad step and you're falling 42 floors to the ground. So that's probably, yeah, that's true. But what if the safety net tears? I mean, so I'm guessing they have a positive, they demand money. I imagine they make pretty good salaries to do that job. How about a ski instructor in the Swiss Alps? That's a nice place, right? So it's probably in fact, I had a student once who said, oh yeah, my brother was a ski instructor in the Swiss Alps, and he didn't actually earn any salary. he was just there because he loved doing it. So that's probably, you'll probably give up some salary. Okay, private school teacher in a wealthy suburban area. Probably positive, because you're probably working with dedicated students, or at least students who have parents who are really pushing them to succeed. Probably pretty good working conditions. Now, the research I do has a lot to do with teachers in developing countries and distribution of those teachers, who teaches in what types of schools, and it's very difficult to be a teacher in a remote rural school in a developing country context because the conditions are very difficult. So in those conditions, you would probably demand a higher salary, but you wouldn't get it because you're in a developing country context. So what happens is the system is kind of, in many countries, I found this in many countries, the system is kind of designed to ensure that when your first job as a teacher, because you don't have many choices, is teaching out in a rural area. Even though theoretically you should be demanding higher salary, but you don't have an option because that's the way the system is designed. And then finally, I don't know the answer to this, public school teacher in Hong Kong. Like a teacher in primary school, high school, is that considered a prestigious, high status job, a desirable job? I'm not sure. I don't know.
It should usually be considered in Hong Kong as a stable or high income job, but in the past it would be a high reputation, but now it's not quite, because you're always bombarded by the parents for bringing the children's low academic achievement.
I see. So maybe it's mixed. I would say in the United States, it's not a very high status job. So you theoretically would demand a higher compensating differential. But because the salaries are very rigid, I think this is the case in most countries, and they're determined exclusively by your education level and your experience, that the salaries don't actually adjust based on that compensating differential. So what you may have, so what happens, I think, in many cases is, rather than paying more for more teachers or high quality teachers, the standard for teacher quality decreases, and teachers who are less qualified end up being hired because there's not flexibility in terms of providing that compensating differential. You earn the same salary no matter what type of school you're working in if you're in the same district in the United States. I see that my time is almost up, so I'm going to move ahead just talking about some evidence about, so let's look again to the evidence base, in this case about compensating differentials for teachers. So what do we find from research related to compensating differentials? So Chambers found that public school teachers earn 25 to 119% more than private school teachers, suggesting that public school teachers demand more salary, or private teachers forego salary because of the difference in working conditions across public and private. Some other studies have found that teachers demand more to teach in classes with 25% more low-income students. So teachers actually respond to the teaching conditions and their student population in terms of demanding more salaries. So it might be more difficult to teach low-income students because they're coming to school less prepared, so teachers may demand more salaries. Now this study by Goldtaber and colleagues actually used the other approach, where they actually surveyed teachers and they asked them, would you rather have $5,000 in salary, extra salary, or would you have like to have this other difference in working conditions? So they said, would you rather have $5,000 or 2 fewer students in your class? Remember, again, they're always comparing with class size reduction, right? Because class size reduction is expensive. So 83% of teachers prefer the salary increase. Now, would you rather have $5,000 or a full-time teacher's aide shared by 4 teachers? So 1/4 of a teaching assistant. Not surprisingly, 88% of teachers prefer the salary increase. But if they ask, would you rather have $5,000 increase or 3.5 more hours of preparation time per week? Actually, only 69%, so the reduction in how many teachers prefer the salary increase. But these are all things that are cost equivalent. The cost is equivalent to $5,000 increase. So you can see that teachers, in terms of their preferences, care about some things more than others. But compensating differentials are likely to vary a lot across countries and cultures depending on the status of the teaching profession. In high status teaching, in societies where teachers have high status, you may need to pay them less because they're foregoing salary in order to have that high prestige job. So it's important to consider the context. So finally, in considering all this evidence in this discussion, how do we think about developing evidence-based strategies to improve teacher quality? So what are some of the strategies or the considerations that we should take account of in trying to improve teacher quality? And this can be from the perspective of a school principal in a school, from the perspective of a university president or provost, from the perspective of a community leader, from the perspective of a national education system. These are some of the things that we should consider. Identify the competing options. So for example, Teach for America, National Board Certification. Recognize the underlying assumptions. What are the assumptions that are beneath these options? Look to the evidence base. And I didn't really talk about that aspect too much, but so the evidence I'm presenting here, for the most part, comes from peer-reviewed studies that are published in peer-reviewed articles. So look to high-quality, peer-reviewed research. What do they find about the assumptions and the options? And then consider the local context. For example, is teaching a high prestige job in this context, or is it not? Do we need to offer extra salary, or do we not? And then design policies and practices that follow. So just to give a couple examples, now we may be able to identify the actual assumptions first. So if we know about the assumptions, then we can look at the underlying policy options related to those assumptions. So let's say that we think that or we recognize the assumption, or we believe this assumption that great teachers are born. We may, the policy response will be to invest in the recruitment and retention of great teachers, like TFA. We also may consider alternative routes to certification, providing teachers opportunity to enter the classroom immediately and then get their certification as they're teaching, as I did. Or some economists actually argue, let's do away with certification requirements altogether and just let everyone come in and then we can identify who the great teachers are. Because as we increase certification requirements, we may be putting up obstacles to those people who would be great teachers if there were no requirements. Okay, but again, the assumption there is that great teachers are born. If the assumption is that great teachers are made, then we'll want to invest in high quality initial preparation and continued professional development for teachers. And we may want to increase certification requirements for teachers. So those are very different approaches based on our assumptions and what the evidence base tells us. Now the second question we talked about, what do teachers care about? If we believe that teachers care about salaries, we may invest in teacher salaries and bonuses, really focus on what is the compensating differential that we need to get these teachers here. And consider merit pay for highly effective teachers. We haven't talked about that, but this is an approach that many school districts or systems have tried to incentivize teachers through recognizing teachers who have increased student test scores over time, or what's called value-added based pay. Now, if we think that teachers care about working conditions, we will use altogether different strategies. So we might improve teacher working conditions and support. We might make sure that new teachers in particular have lots of support. They have induction programs. Induction programs are programs that support new teachers in the first couple of years, and that they have mentors. Mentoring has been shown to be in the research, in the literature, a really important way to ensure that teachers stay and don't leave the profession. So again, it's really important to identify what those assumptions are and what the related policy responses are. Now, you could apply this formula or this approach to any questions that you have about teachers or education more generally. So, to provide you with kind of a way to think about this in the future, here's sort of a planning document. You could identify two competing options, identify the underlying assumptions, and then look to the research base, look to peer-reviewed research related to these questions and these responses, and then consider context. What are the contextual considerations or modifications for your specific context? And finally, what should be your policy or practice response based on assumptions, evidence, and contextual modifications? And you can do that to compare various options, like Teach for America, No Child Left Behind. And that is it. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.